Hi, I'm here today with Robert Harrap in Tapley Court in Maidenhead, or near Maidenhead. And you're the General Director of SGI in the UK. For people who don't really know, what is SGI?
Okay. SGI stands for Soccer Gakkai International.
Yeah.
So we're an international organisation. Soccer Gakkai are two Japanese words. Gakkai would translate as something like society or association, and soccer has nothing to do with football, but is to do with an idea of value creation. Value often has a meaning of finance or economics, but it's really to do with the potential of a human life, that we're a society of people who practice a particular form of Buddhism with the idea of really making the most of our lives.
So that kind of idea of value sounds much more like the ethics idea of value than
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
sense of financial value. But you mentioned then that it's a form of Buddhism,
Yes.
or it comes from within the Buddhist fold. And so it didn't start in the UK.
No,
It starts further away.
that's right. Of course, Buddhism obviously has its roots in northern India. And through the centuries, as Buddhism spread across Asia, one of the places it ended up was in Japan. And lots of different Buddhist traditions either found their way to Japan or developed in Japan. And in the 13th century, there was a great Buddhist reformer whose name was Nichiren. He was based around Kamakura, which is on the coast of Japan. And he looked at the different schools and traditions of Buddhism that he was aware of. And he saw that there was a need for a reformation. And so he started a kind of a revised approach, which was very, very pragmatic and a very dynamic approach to Buddhism as well.
And I think pragmatic and dynamic are rather good terms for SGI as I understand it, and that it seems very much focused on people's lives, and rather than drawing people into a certain kind of revolution in their doctrines about things, it seems to want to be making some kind of difference in how people live or people's response to their everyday lives.
Absolutely. There's a term that we use, in English we use the phrase human revolution, which is a translation of a Japanese expression. And I think it encapsulates brilliantly the idea that there have been lots of attempts through history to change society through external changes. But Nichiren Buddhism recognises that society will only really change fundamentally when individuals change, have an inner transformation. And so we interpret Nichiren Buddhism to show us the way to have that human revolution, that inner transformation, that will make a difference not only to ourselves but to other people as well.
And that sort of sideways brings me to what I wanted to ask you about as well, which is a more personal question really, which is how you found yourself sat here in the south of England, far from Japan, far from the 13th century, practicing this kind of religious practice. So is it kind of a story which is about a personal human revolution that led you to be where you are today in this organisation and this place?
Right. Well, I've been practicing for 30 years. I first heard about Nichiren Buddhism in 1986. I was 21 and I had had a motorbike accident and smashed my leg and was not very happy about what the effect that was having on my life. And someone who knew me a little bit and who'd started to practice Nichiren Buddhism picked up on my life condition, my life state, and just suggested that, the first phrase that this woman used was that she said, you should be chanting for your leg to get better. And my initial response, I think was quite cynical. I couldn't see how chanting was going to make a difference, but she was very, very sure and confident that it would. And she showed me how to chant. There are lots of different Buddhist traditions, but Nichiren Buddhism is focused around the chanting of a particular phrase, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. There's some other aspects to it as well, but that's at the heart of it. And she gave me things to read, and I started the process of being very interested in the philosophy, but also very quickly seeing that it did make me feel different about my life and my broken leg. But also, very importantly, I think, the way I'd been living my life beforehand. Before the accident, I thought I was living a very creative life. But actually, it took the accident and then having this different perspective for me to see that my life wasn't as creative as I thought it was.
That's really kind of interesting, because if people know anything about this kind of Buddhism, they tend to know something about chanting. They've perhaps heard of it or heard reference to certain things. And there's often a stereotype that people will chant to make the external world change, to kind of somehow enchant external circumstances and changing. The account you just given of your involvement in chanting seems to be about an internally transformative practice. So it didn't necessarily change the world outside you in the way that people sometimes stereotype, but it did something rather kind of profound or transformative to you.
That's right. But I think it's interesting because the perception, is probably right as well, because we believe that there's an expression which we use, which the president of SGI on one occasion said. He said, "When we change, the world changes." But this is the process starts with this inner change, and of course there are Buddhist principles. The oneness of self and the environment is something that we study, and we look and see how it applies in our lives. The interconnectedness of all things. Sometimes we talk about the principle of dependent origination, which is about the web of life and how things are extraordinarily connected. So in a way, it's not a surprise that people pick up on this idea of Buddhist chanting for external change, but perhaps they miss the stage, the very important stage, which is that we're chanting to have an inner change first, and that consequentially there will be an external change.
And I guess the most profound reading of dependent origination is actually that border between me and the world is actually more complicated and less straightforward than it seems. But the bit of it that I can affect now, today, tomorrow, is the bit that's, I'm kind of occupying. So it's kind of that, I guess the more you study it, the more you think about it, the more complicated that becomes in terms of how you sort of work out what is me and what is the external world. But I guess your journey in it starts with a bit of the world that you can affect.
Yes.
Rather than some very grand change the world thing. Change the world in tiny ways is kind of incremental.
Yes.
Towards a broader.
Exactly. We start where we are.
Yeah.
And then your perspective changes. And I think, on my journey, the first thing I was chanting about was my leg and my circumstances.
You were sat there feeling kind of miserable and couldn't live your 21-year-old life.
That's right, yes. Yeah. Things had to go on hold, and for an unknown period of time. And in fact, it took me about a year after the accident before I was walking again without a stick. So it was quite a big chunk of time. But those inner realizations that I started to have, and the different perspectives I had on life, I see those as the kind of early benefits of practicing and starting to chant.
And that's a very Buddhist principle in a very broad sense of being able to control not necessarily every external factor, but being able to have some control of your response to it is, in some Buddhist traditions, about what freedom actually means. About kind of exploring that. Well, I think certainly for our students gives them much more of a sense of what SGI is, and importantly what it isn't. And thank you for sharing a bit of your personal experiences with us as well.
Pleasure.